Welcome to Season 4 of the Retail Tea Break podcast. My name is Melissa Moore, the Retail Advisor, and each week I'll be joined by industry experts, retailers and product creators to decode the myths, share knowledge and give you an insight into the retail industry. So grab your cup of tea, sit back, relax and listen in to Season 4 of the Retail Tea Break podcast. Today's episode of the Retail Tea Break podcast is sponsored by Salesforce, who bring companies and customers together. I'm joined by a guest who thrives in a high-growth, fast-paced environment and is focused on creating strong strategic relationships with customers. This former retailer and flagship store manager has been involved in several up-and-coming technology companies as well. Now, in his 8th year at Salesforce, today's guest has a vast amount of experience across all industries. Scott Kennedy, Regional Vice President for Salesforce Commerce Cloud across the UK and Ireland. Welcome to the Retail Tea Break podcast.
Great. Well, firstly, Melissa, thank you very much for having me on the show this morning. And also thank you very much for the kind words and wonderful introduction. So as you nicely introduced me, my name is Scott Kennedy. I've been at Salesforce for the past 7 years or so, just in my 8th year now. And as you mentioned, I currently lead our Commerce Cloud business for retail in the UK and Ireland. So I guess simply put, Commerce Cloud within Salesforce provides our customers with an e-commerce platform to enable retailers to create those seamless experiences for their customers through digital channels. And then in terms of briefly just who we work with, to maybe give you a bit of context around that, we are fortunate to be in a position that we power over 7,000 sites globally, but specifically within the UK and Ireland, we work with the likes of Currys and Sweaty Betty in the UK, and then locally here in Ireland, we work with the likes of Lifestyle Sports and Brown Thomas Ireland.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's nice, as you say, to put a bit of context to that. Tell us briefly, though, because I love to ask this question to guests, in the time that it takes to boil a kettle, which is about 2 minutes, and just that play on the Retail Tea Break podcast thing. Tell us a bit about your background, because again, it's fascinating when it comes to tech and commerce and a little bit of retail in there, which I think is really going to excite our audience.
Yeah, so I guess if I give you a little bit of context, my background pre-Salesforce. So I was fortunate to have a company for about 4 years or so and have always worked in retail before starting the company. Essentially, we worked with a lot of retailers to take people's kind of social profile data and essentially build out a profile on each individual to help you personalize the experiences for them and kind of the communications that you would send to them. That went well. Ultimately, we were backed by the likes of Telefonica, and then ultimately got to a position like any fledgling startup where we struggled to really find product market fit. And I guess that's at a point where I was fortunate enough on the journey to actually meet a few people in Salesforce, and ultimately that's what brought me into the company, and then specifically why I was so excited to work with retailers, just with a lot of the technology that Salesforce had that you could ultimately buy off the shelf and obviously tweak it and customize for your direct needs. But I think that's what led me to joining Salesforce, and it has ultimately kept me here for the past few years.
It's fantastic, though, and I love that authenticity. It's kind of nice to know that you and a lot of your team have that background, especially when they're working with retailers like that. So it's great to hear that. I suppose you've been through that rocky road, shall we say, to be honest, that an awful lot of listeners have been, an awful lot of companies have been, especially over the last kind of 10, 15 years. So great to hear that. So Salesforce, you have an awful lot of data collected yourselves. What are you noticing right now? What are the key trends? What's happening in retail at the moment from your perspective?
Yeah, perfect. So I think, we're fortunate. So I was fortunate enough to be at NRF in New York at the start of January, which was great to get a global view on just what retailers are seeing across the board. And obviously we had a few colleagues that were in Shop Talk in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and I've had a few conversations again, what they're seeing from a global perspective, trying to tie it back then to what we're actually seeing client side within the UK and Ireland. I think firstly, the context on the landscape, as we all know, retail has been through a lot and evolved a huge amount over the past few years. I think we've come out the other side where maybe over the past 2 years, if you like, pre-peak this year, we've been through a period where digital revenue saw unprecedented growth, and it was all about digital revenue growth. And now we've moved into a period where, obviously, won't go into it in too much because it probably pains me around what's happening in the macro environment in terms of supply chain issues, inflation, etc. But I think what we've kind of seen is digital growth ultimately is starting to taper off, albeit that we're working from a much bigger baseline because it did grow so much in 2020, 2021, and for the first half of 2022. And I think broadly, when we're dealing, especially with omni-channel retailers at the moment, it's almost a flip-flop in strategy, in that some months in-store is doing really, really well. So everyone is starting to really hone in on the strategy for in-store. And then in other months, it's going back to digital. So I guess it's a little bit unpredictable at the moment. But overall, what that means, what we're seeing really from, I guess, going back to this macro environment component, really what we're seeing in terms of these company priorities, it's one, how do we drive efficient revenue growth? And I think I use the word efficient in that, how do we grow our revenues while our cost of acquisition and our cost to serve is as optimized as possible, which will ultimately lead to increased profit margins within the business. And then the other piece is around how do we actually optimize our spend? And that spend, I think, really around our technology systems to remove a lot of the manual processes that we have within a lot of retailers today, is ultimately what we're seeing at a company level. And then I guess the final piece is just actually what are the themes under all of this in terms of that companies need to be aware of. I think the first one is a huge shift to focus in loyalty and retention, which is ultimately just being driven by everything that's happening with third-party cookie and the new legislation coming in there, but also just the cost of acquisition has obviously continuously increased over the past few years, but at a point now where retailers, I think, are really starting to focus on the great existing customer base that they have today. The second theme that we're probably seeing is around, actually, I mentioned the flip-flopping between in-store and then digital channels. I think really the retailers that will get it really right are focused on this omni-channel strategy and really connecting all customer touch points, so we can, one, optimize this experience across the two channels, but also track our customers. So we know that I think one area retailers struggle with it today is if in-store is doing well, digital maybe drops a little bit, there's no view, like that digital customer could be in store, which I think a lot of retailers don't have a view on. And then the final one, which we're really excited about, is just leveraging AI. And I think there's lots of discussion points around AI at the moment, especially with ChatGPT. But I think really when we talk about personalizations, it's how can we're collecting all this great data around our customers. How can we actually action this data to really give personalized recommendations at each touch point of the journey, both in store and across our digital channels?
It sounds so exciting though when you talk about it. Like, it is a slightly unnerving time, as you said, right now, but there's so much positivity within the industry, and there seems to be scope now more than ever to go places with this stuff. But to lean into a point you had there, it's really clear, and look, we have COVID to blame for this. It's really clear that customers, they got used to online during COVID. Of course they did. They were back out in the real world last year. So now they want the best of both worlds. Let's be really clear. But they want these mega experiences across both channels. So then for you, retailers have to deliver this like true idea of omni-channel. And you use that term, and I might even ask you to explain it, because I actually think an awful lot of retailers are still getting this wrong. So to get a true omni-channel experience, in your view, what does that look like?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give you a kind of overview on what we actually mean and define omnichannel, and then maybe try to bring it to life with giving a couple of stories around that. But I think if we think about omnichannel, we've got, in its simplest form, we've got brick and mortar in store, we've got then our e-commerce platform, and then also we've got the channels around that. So the likes of Instagram, TikTok, social channels that now you can actually start transacting on. I think really when we define the omni-channel journeys for a customer, there's just so many different touch points, which ultimately makes it harder for customers, for retailers, to embed the key message and key personal product recommendations at every touch throughout this. So I think it's really, how can we engage our customers with the just leveraging the data that we have to ensure that they're just not shopping elsewhere, which will also lead to driving up loyalty for the customer base as well. But if we think about a real world example, again, going back to maybe just an e-commerce with brick and mortar example, it was about 2 weeks ago, I was over in London for Retail Week Awards, which is a fabulous event kind of celebrating the UK retail community. And classic, didn't realize that I didn't have a shirt with me when I was traveling over. So I just quickly ordered through Charles Church Shirts, who obviously do same day delivery, next day delivery, have a few different options. So I got it for next day delivery. And I realized when I got delivered to the office, realized when I opened it that I had actually forgotten to order cufflinks. So there's luckily a Charles Church shirt just beside our Charles Church Shirts store just beside our office in London, and I just popped down, managed to grab. So I had the shirt with me. The retail assistant was great and gave me recommendation on cufflinks. So went up to the till, got the cufflinks. But then one thing when we think about how do we join up this journey and actually then start driving loyalty is they at point of sale very simply have just employed e-receipts. So at that point of sale, I popped in. I don't have a loyalty program or anything with Charles Church Shirts, so I gave them my email address, which tied it back to my overall profile, which then allows them to, one, understand what have I actually bought, two, what channels have I been purchasing on. But then the third point is as you get this round review on what I've purchased, they can get smarter with what product recommendations they can actually start surfacing then in email communications after the fact.
That just sums it up in a nutshell, doesn't it? So actually, two really good, clear experiences. One, obviously online, you bought a shirt. The other one, great service in store. But it's that tying together. And I think it's that tying together aspect that so many retailers just aren't getting right now. And of course, if they do, as you said, they have the data. They could therefore hyper-personalize that next experience for you, which is going to keep you coming back.
Yeah, agreed. And I think another good example, so that's an example of a really good customer experience. Like for me, really good in terms of all the comms I've gotten since and everything. So it's just a nice customer experience. If we think then back to the so what for the retailer, and actually one huge thing is around this employee experience as well. So I think a really good example that we had, we have done a webinar with Fenwick in the UK. They ultimately went into COVID where a lot of pressures were obviously put on the warehouses where stock was being stored, lots of new measures being put in place. So hard to serve a lot of the orders. They quickly pivoted to actually turn their stores, which were shut, into effectively distribution centers, which one means they opened up a lot of new ways to fulfill orders. So when we talk about buy online, pick up in store, if we want to ship from store, one, this unified approach to retail offers great customer experiences, but for the employees, it actually blurs the lines between the internal teams, such as merchandising team, marketing team, and digital team. And now you actually have a collective working towards one common goal, if you like, while then the output being we've opened up new channels to re-deliver those great customer experiences.
It's amazing how it always comes back to that. It's always about customer centricity. It's always about enhancing each of those touch points, as you talk about, whether it's online, the blurred bit in the middle, or it's physical store. It's kind of lovely to know that the retailer's getting it right, constantly putting the customer at the heart of everything. But most retailers, and let's be really brutally honest, are so guilty of chasing the new customer all the time. They're looking for the next new one. They're looking to entice the next new one over. But research shows us that this is it's ridiculously expensive. Whereas, instead of just giving that new customer 10 or 20% off, or, obviously the marketing spend itself to entice that customer, we could just be kind of encouraging our existing customer base to come and shop with us. How should retailers be reframing that to focus on their loyal customer base that they already have?
Yeah, good question. I think actually what we saw during Cyber Week as well last year, a lot of retailers actually were discounting less. And I think the ones that are really good and have a loyal customer base, they need to discount less, which ultimately means that you're just driving higher margins as a retailer from each order. But I think we know it's gotten a lot harder to acquire customers. It's a lot more expensive. And there is a shift now in terms of, okay, what is the focus on this engagement strategy for ultimately driving up the lifetime value of each customer? I think it's a challenging one because loyalty itself is under pressure from the customer base due to the, I guess, economic squeeze that we're seeing at the moment, and people potentially still shopping around for better deals. But I think the companies that get it right ultimately have to get this single view of a customer. I think that's where a lot of retailers struggle, especially omni-channel retailers, because we might have lots of rich data in terms of our point of sale data. We might have our e-commerce data. We might have our marketing data. We've got all this really, really good stuff. But when it lives in these different silos and different tools, it gets very hard to really personalize that experience across these channels. So I think retailers that are getting it right are focusing on how can we amalgamate all of this data into one solution. Once we amalgamate it all in, we can have one true profile on each customer, which will then allow us to do things like the correct customer segments, to do the right personalization of products, and then across those each disparate channel today. Because I think that's probably a key thing, is for a lot of retailers, they are very disparate today, meaning that you or I as a consumer are probably going to be getting comms through different channels that might not be relevant to us. Or when we land on a certain website, we may see products that are of no interest to us. And I think at each of those touch points, if that happens, you run the risk as a retailer of increasing the abandonment rate and the likelihood that someone will actually transact with you.
That's really scary. And again, you've put that so well, that actually if you're showing me the wrong product, of course I'm going to go elsewhere. So not only now have you not retained me as a customer, you've lost me as a customer, and you're almost pushing me into your competition's hands because they're obviously waving at me and want to entice me over. Do you think it's as simple as that? Because certainly it seems like at the moment, as you say, if we're quite price conscious as consumers, which a lot of us have to be right now at the moment, are we actually doing ourselves a disservice from not strategizing with this data, as you said? Because if it's in different silos, if we're not feeding that back into the company, are we then just actually pushing consumers away?
Yeah, I think if you or I, and we're all consumers, right? I think you build loyalty with a brand if your expectations are met every single time. So I think and I think a lot of time we actually, sometimes expectations aren't met, but most people will pay a higher price. And this is backed by research as well. Yeah. You'll pay a higher price if you know the experience is good, you know the products are going to arrive if and when they say they arrive, if I've got the ability to return that item through different channels. So if I buy something online, return it in store for a different size. Those type of experiences is ultimately what builds that loyalty. So I think we are doing a disservice, I think you're right, to both the retailers and also to our customers if we're not centralizing all of this rich data that we have. Because I think, to my point earlier, a lot of retailers are great at collecting it, but I think the ones that are truly differentiating themselves in the market are the ones who actually act on that data. So one, we drive insight from it and understand the different shopping behaviors, but how can we actually act on this data and leverage some of the tools that we probably have already to ensure that we get to that utopia state of real-time customer engagement is ultimately what we're trying to get to, which is good. We're in a position now that there's lots of tools in the market, Salesforce being one of those that has these tools to enable you to do that and automate a lot of these processes, both for the internal teams, but then having that automation there just means it's real time for your customers.
I love it. And you know what, you've alluded to it there, but I've got to ask while I have you, we've obviously talked about the key trends, we've talked about issues. What can you guys offer? What are Salesforce doing for some of those key customers that you've mentioned, whether it's in the UK or Ireland or globally? What is it you can offer to help these retailers really drive home their message, but also to capture that customer and keep them?
Yeah, good question. So I guess to try and simplify, if we look back to the key themes that we're seeing in the market, it's the shift in focus to loyalty and retention. It's how do we deliver this truly unified and omni-channel experience for our customers? And then how are we leveraging all this rich data that we're gathering in AI to offer personalization? So in short, if you miss me to not say that Salesforce have the tools in place for these trends. And I guess how we're helping customers achieve this, it's twofold. So there's always one side, which is one bucket of like the technology, and there's lots of technology vendors in the market. I think the benefit with Salesforce and how Salesforce has evolved is we've been fortunate enough to acquire different solutions as the company has grown, like the likes of e-commerce platform, marketing platform, and the service capabilities as well. So I think one is around technology, but the other side is more the success and aligning the expert resources that we have internally to help customers and new customers leverage the technology in a right way, and ultimately innovating then on the technology that we have in place to address what the market is actually demanding within the space of a few months versus waiting with the risk of potentially losing your customers.
Exciting. But I do, as you say, and I know Deirdre, when she was on a few weeks ago, spoke about that. There's so much you can offer. So it's nice to know that you can connect fully across all those silos to really bring these different channels to life for customers. So final question, as always, what's coming up for you and even your part of Salesforce over the next few months?
Yeah, so next few months are an interesting one. I think given the pressures in the market at the moment that we talked to at the start, just around what's top of mind for a lot of companies. I think for the next few months for us, we're really focused on just partnering with our customers over the next few months. So I mentioned we do a lot of innovation. So within specifically Commerce Cloud, we do about 8 releases a year to ensure that we have the latest tools for our customers. I think the ones that we're really excited about at the moment, which have been recent announcements, are one around the social channel integration. So one stat that alarmed me recently, actually, not to digress too much, but was the fact that TikTok has now overtaken YouTube in terms of the amount of daily views. So I think the really interesting, yeah, I know. So I think the one really interesting side is like looking at Gen Z, looking at buyer behaviors. Like it's just so different. Like you or I, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to put you into one specific tier, but like I know for me, if I'm starting my search journey, it's typically on Google, right?
Yeah.
I'll go to Google, I'll typically search for something. But if we actually look at Gen Z, like search for a restaurant, it starts on TikTok. Searching for products, it starts on TikTok. So I think that is a really interesting new trend that's emerged for a lot of retailers, and what we've worked really closely with the likes of TikTok and Meta to partner so we can actually start surfacing e-commerce product catalogs ultimately on the likes of TikTok, so people can actually find your products and transact through that channel. So I think the next few months will be really partnering with our customers to ensure that they have the right tools in place, and then we're giving them the right business resource to implement these tools and make them successful. So I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves over the next few months, to be honest, because I think the evolution that we're seeing within retail is happening a lot quicker at the moment, and some of the new strategies that are being put in place.
It's so exciting though, like it really is. And that's fascinating. I think this whole Gen Z generation in that respect are really shaking things up, but for the better for retail. And it's great to know that you're right on board there and leading from the front, of course, with Salesforce. So Thank you again to Salesforce for sponsoring today's episode. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please like and share it. And remember that you can also listen back to past Retail Tea Break episodes on your favourite podcast platform or even on YouTube. And then please connect with myself or Scott on LinkedIn, or follow Salesforce Ireland and the Retail Advisor across social media. And I'll obviously pop the website link for Salesforce in the show notes. So for today, Scott, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Melissa. It's been a pleasure.